Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News, and after a crucial Barcelona Grand Prix where Ferrari lost the lead of both championships to Red Bull and Max Verstappen, the crucial question that they have to answer is why exactly did Charles Leclerc's power unit fail, costing him a chance of what seemed to be a relatively routine victory. They believe overheating was the fundamental cause of their issues, potentially due to the high track temperatures, a key issue they're going to have to solve as we move forward for the rest of the season. Very much enjoying your thoughts in the comment section below, hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. On the verge of 2k, firstly, wanted to mention this real quick. There was a lot of talk going about this after the race. Pretty sure Hamilton had just come back from kind of like doping test or whatever, and he's clearly like, well, at least the initial image, which are like this, seemed like he was kind of checking out the rear wing of Max Verstappen's car, which of course last year put Verstappen in a bit of trouble when he did the same thing to Hamilton at the Brazilian Grand Prix, got the €50,000 fine or whatever it was. Now in the video itself, you can very clearly see that he's doing his best to try and like skirt around it. Of course, that rear wing that was causing Verstappen some troubles last weekend, but this I thought was actually rather interesting from Hamilton after the race, just because there was all the talk after the last year. Okay, is Hamilton going to step away? Even this season at the start of it seemed very kind of, frustrated, understandably so, with the state of the car. He's been used to having pretty much the best or second best car on the grid the last several years, and now of course, well, it hasn't been the case so far, but they're certainly getting back to that point. But this I thought was rather interesting just on Hamilton's future really in the sport, because we know Alonso and Vettel, like, they're continuing on, rather long in their careers. As he describes, yesterday was just another day that reminded me just how much I love this sport. Going from your emotions hitting the floor to ending on a high is such a thrill. All of our hard work as a team is starting to pay off. Together we are making progress. Can't wait for this upcoming weekend, of course, in Monaco. So probably indicating, like, if Hamilton feels confident that the car is going to be good for the rest of this year, next year as well, he's probably going to stick around in the sport. Speaking of Mercedes, though, not everyone is so confident that Mercedes are fully back. Mattia Binotto from Ferrari said after the fact that, like, look, okay, congrats to them, they're improving, they're looking okay, but still, they finished about 30 seconds behind the Red Bull, could have been, 40 plus seconds behind Charles. They still lack 6 to 7 tenths, right? We saw in qualifying 6 tenths or so down, but they believe they've got a better race car, which of course was proved in the race, where we saw it was actually Hamilton only about 3 tenths of a second on average behind what Verstappen was doing over the course of the race. So they're certainly closer. Are they close enough? Will these words come back to bite Ferrari, right? Because of course they looked like the first few races of the season it was going to be a runaway, so not never a runaway really. It's always going to be a little bit difficult, but it seemed like Ferrari were in pole position, frankly, to take the championships, well, both of the championships this year. Just 6 races in now, 3 races after they had a massive lead, things have very much turned on their heads. Now, before we discuss what Ferrari are going to do, I wanted to touch on McLaren real quick, just because Norris, of course, last weekend was diagnosed with tonsillitis. They're certainly hoping he's going to get back in business, but the gap still between Norris and Ricciardo in the race, given the fact that Norris was feeling terrible, and you could tell it before and after the race as well, like he put in an absolute monster stint, there's no doubt, on Sunday, but Ricciardo was still way behind, and they've effectively made it clear, McLaren, that as the article describes, McLaren warned Ricciardo he is not meeting our expectations. Basically saying that, look, right now Norris is just outperforming, the Australian driver Ricciardo on all metrics, and they're not happy with him, right? And there's been these rumours about the likes of Colton Herta, or even the likes of Pato O'Ward from their IndyCar team could potentially come into that seat, right? So if things continue as they are, Ricciardo is probably not going to have a seat there next year, right? That's just kind of how, like, if McLaren is saying this to the public, then it certainly doesn't paint the greatest picture. But of course, Ferrari, look, they're still trying to make strides in the right direction. Their car this weekend did look much better than it had done before, like, not just in terms of qualifying pace, but also early in the race, right? When it was Max versus Charles up front, it did seem like Charles was kind of putting a little bit of edge on him lap by lap, right? I think Verstappen even said after the race that he was pulling away a little bit. So it did feel like Ferrari had kind of found another gear this weekend, but of course the power unit failure brought paid to that right now. They've got some further upgrades coming, apparently some major ones scheduled for Silverstone and Spa respectively, but Canada just in early June, they're going to have some kind of tweaks, aero adjustments right there, but they did find some extra strength this weekend. Of course, Carlos Sainz, I believe, when he went off the track, suffered some floor damage, therefore he wasn't able to, he was missing about a second or lap or so from where he kind of should have been in terms of race pace, but yeah, of course the biggest tough Sunday was for Leclerc, who seems to be running away with a relatively easy victory after Verstappen, where he went off the track, got stuck behind George Russell. Leclerc had a massive victory that probably he wouldn't have rescinded unless it, of course, it was for the engine failure that comes through. Now, this seemingly is the cause of the issue, right? Mattia Binotto said after the fact, probably when the engine blows up like that, some of these parts are ruined. It turns out the turbo, the MGUH, like both those parts have been damaged beyond repair. They do say that there was some sort of like protection mode the engine went into, which ensured that the rest of the engine is actually okay. So they're going to have to change certainly some parts in the engines. This is almost certainly what this is certainly going to mean. They're going to have to take an engine penalty at some point or another. Pretty sure they were already planning to, though, so this might mean they have to take further penalties. But yeah, they're going to have to change some parts around. Ferrari say they're satisfied, though. This is rather interesting. I thought it did not occur through a design fault or a reliability issue with those two components or any other element of the PU. Saying, okay, it's not the design is fine, the reliability is fine. So what exactly caused the problem, right? Like, does it mean someone has installed it wrong, or they've kind of not appropriately like dealt with the temperatures and stuff that were rising? Because of course Mercedes at the end of the race, they were like, look, Lewis, George, back off, like, lift and coast on the straights because our engine's overheating dramatically. Might have been what happened here with Leclerc, because as is described, the MGU-H apparently overheated on Sunday and sent the power unit into a protection mode where effectively they had to just retire the car because the turbocharger of the MGU-H were, well, damaged beyond repair. Now, rather interestingly, as has just come out actually, Ferrari are apparently worried that the MGU-H failure on Sunday occurred due to high temperatures. Ferrari are trying to study aerodynamic solutions to bring more airflow into the side pods to keep the PU cool. This is kind of one of the key issues we thought about Mercedes coming into the year. Okay, with these tiny side pods on some of the hotter tracks, are they going to be able to keep the engine functioning properly? Of course, they did kind of have that issue towards the end of the race, but generally it's been not too bad for them, whereas Ferrari, really, it's the first time we thought they would have this issue. We thought, looking at their side pods, they should be getting plenty of air in there, but apparently due to the high track temperatures, right, it was an absolutely scorching weekend, but it's far from the only race this year that's going to have such temperatures. Like, apparently that was causing massive issues for them. It was certainly hotter than a lot of teams expected it to be, but apparently that was the key cause of their issues this weekend, right? So it's really tough to say what they can do. Of course, they're going to study some aerodynamic changes that can, well, allow them to have a little bit, higher airflow into the engines for cooling, right? But it's not really an issue that Red Bull have had to deal with so far this year, which does, of course, raise the question as time progresses, these hotter tracks might cause them issues. Now, there are certainly some positives they are taking away, as is described right here. The upgrade package in Spain worked well. They thought they'd get about 0.3 of a second out of it. That's pretty much exactly what they got. They thought with the new rear wing, it was very fast on both the straight in quali and the race. But we know that really, our understanding is that the Ferrari power unit right now has a bit of an edge on Red Bull and certainly a bit of an edge on Mercedes. Think about 5 horsepower to the Honda engine, the Red Bull powertrains engine, 10 horsepower or so to the Mercedes engine. So they should be a little bit better in a straight line than the others are. But of course, Red Bull has that very, well, low drag kind of aerodynamic effect, which Ferrari haven't quite been able to match as of yet. But certainly this weekend, in terms of straight line speeds, the Red Bull didn't seem to have quite the advantage on the Mercedes and of course the Ferrari than they have had most recently. But I'm like, if you don't finish the race, you're not going to finish first or something along those lines. Another positive that Charles Leclerc describes right here, the upgrades on the car have though been really positive. They've, well, helped us to gain performance. Everything has worked as kind of expected. Very good news, not always the case. Also about tyre degradation, right? We certainly saw that in, for example, the Imola Grand Prix and in Miami, they seem to have far, well, worse tyre degradation than the Red Bulls. Apparently they've kind of stepped that up. Of course, like, it's Barcelona, it's one race. It, as he says, a little premature to say that it might be really fixed, but that was one of their key issues before, where Verstappen could effectively just sit behind Leclerc, wait for his tyres to blow up, then take the lead of the race. While he had to pit a little bit earlier than Verstappen had to, right? So that was kind of a key upgrade that they've had, but and look, I do wonder how this race would have played out if, unfortunately, well, for Charles Leclerc, that engine did not decide to give up the ghost. And that, of course, being the long-term implication here, that what exactly happens with this in terms of engines they're going to take. Apparently they have been planning to take 4 anyway, right? Of course, they're planning these races, or these kind of engine parts to take, 5 or 6, 7, 8 races each. Now, they believe that they're going to put kind of the first power unit effectively back in for Monaco, which is usually done and makes sense to do because kind of a less power dependent circuit. So for Monaco, they're going to put their first power unit back in there. But of course, yeah, they're probably going to have to take some further penalties down the line because of this. So of course, it's not just a big issue for the points they lost, but also for potential penalties down the line as well. And of course, Monaco generally for Charles Leclerc hasn't been all that much better. Maybe his luck is finally going to turn around. When he was in F2, driving in the sprint races, the feature races, and even in all the Grand Prix he's done since then, he's pretty much, well, DNF'd or DNS. So maybe this year is going to be a different story. The Ferrari should be rather good around there. Some people have talked about the Mercedes being good in those slow corners, but I think, well, at least George Russell believes their recent car that they had this past weekends is actually kind of better in the faster corners and on the straights than it is in the slower corners. They actually lost a lot of time. It was actually the Alfa Romeo of Valtteri Bottas that was the fastest car on the track through the last chicane. So maybe that's an indication of some things to come at this weekend in Miami. Charles Leclerc does agree. They're like, look, he's never had any luck in Monaco, but on the other hand, he doesn't believe in bad luck. He believes it's going to turn around. Every point counts, though. He's saying, like, look, it doesn't really matter I'm behind at this point. The season is a long one, as of course it is. But yeah, we kind of thought the development war might be the key this season. Ferrari have already rescinded their advantage. This I did want to touch on because a couple of you guys pointed this out to me, actually, that, well, Sainz versus, of course, Leclerc has been a pretty big talking point so far this year. Sainz always seems significantly off the pace. Apparently that could be due to kind of driving styles. Leclerc seems to prefer a little bit of oversteer, right? Carlos seems to prefer a bit of understeer in his car, and therefore, like, he's kind of said himself, he's struggling to really find it, well, get to grips and find the balance of this car the way he would like to compared to what Leclerc's been able to do. So that kind of maybe explains some of the difference there, but of course, it's not good for Ferrari that even when they have the best car on the weekends, they can't consistently put both cars on the front row, because that, of course, is, well, a key thing to hold Verstappen at bay, whereas, if you're starting on the front row, the DRS overtakes within a few laps from the start, of course, become much more plausible. Now, just speaking of that, actually, look at the difference here in terms of race pace. As as we said, Sainz did have that issue early on, but of course Leclerc retired relatively early. This was the difference in race pace between teammates. Hamilton was actually about 0.3 of a second a lap faster than Russell. Of course, there's so many factors to consider here. This is median lap as well, so not pure average, but the lap time where there was an equal amount of lap times quicker and slower than this one for both of them, so there's a grain of salt, because of course Russell was defending very hard, and Hamilton was probably more often just, in a world of his own, effectively just driving away, but he was putting a significant margin on Russell lap by lap. Verstappen was only slightly quicker than Perez, which I thought was interesting. But look at the gap as well between Norris and Ricciardo, 0.9 of a second a lap, even though Norris was severely ill with tonsillitis. Hopefully that gets better for him. So thought just looking at these numbers was rather interesting here. The closest pairing actually was between Vettel and Stroll this weekend. Bottas, of course, and Joe, but of course he had to retire early on, rather unfortunately for him. And actually it was Latifi, fair play to him, who was faster than Albon this weekend, but he had an awful lot of stuff going on with his kind of tyres. They tried everything, didn't seem to work out for them. Just before we close out the video, I thought this was rather cool as well. It is actually what of current drivers pole to win conversion rate. Verstappen has the highest at 14 poles to, whatever, 71.43% of wins is, I guess, 10 or so wins. I think that's about right. The interesting one here to me is not really what this graphic shows, but just the fact that Charles Leclerc has had 13 poles, but of the races that he's won, he's only ever won from pole. He's never won a race that's not been from pole position. So, maybe that story will change throughout the rest of this year, but that seems to be a necessity for him to get over the finish line and get the checkered flag first. This also, as I kind of like to mention these whenever they come along, the power rankings for the Spanish Grand Prix. Russell takes, in their opinion, driver of the day. Hamilton at 8.8, Charles Leclerc at 9.2. Always interesting, right? Because I feel like Verstappen in these power rankings got somewhat harshly done by when he was forced to retire with issues, where Charles Leclerc gets a 9.2. He didn't really put a foot wrong, obviously, but then his car exploded. So it's always like, how much do you weigh that factor into the race? Because he had a great drive for 20-something laps before his car exploded. So, kind of unfortunate there. But I think Russell and Hamilton, both of those to me were kind of number one, number two driver of the day in some order. Norris up here, Bottas did a pretty good job, but I feel like Bottas might have done a better job than he got credit for, I suppose, on this list. And of course, Monaco's coming up this weekend. Rumour has it that it might be raining, but we'll see about that one as the week progresses. Very much intrigued to your thoughts down below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new as always. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.